with that, Kyle, I'm just going to kick it off and ask you the question that I get when I do my presentations on elections out here. And that question is, Trump and Biden again? Seriously? This is what the United States has? You have two of the most unpopular candidates who have ever run for office against one another. No Haley, no Governor Kemp, no Governor Newsom, no Whitmer. So I want to hear your answer, Kyle. Why is it that we have a Trump-Biden rematch?
So, why Trump and Biden? And so, of course, you've got two candidates who have Biden's got bad approval, Trump's got bad favorability. And, there's going to be a significant share of the electorate that has a negative view of both candidates, which is pretty similar, not as much to 2020 as it is to 2016, in that you had like 15 to 20% of voters who were so-called double haters, in which they had an unfavorable view of both Clinton and Trump. Those voters ended up breaking more toward Trump at the end, which is part of the reason why Trump won that election. Those voters also formed the core of the 6% of people who voted third party. And of course, third party options are part of this election too, that I'm sure we'll get into to some degree. But the thing is that, the voters, particularly on the Republican side, which is more contested, this is the choice they wanted. And it was clear for months and months in advance that, when Governor Ron DeSantis was flying high after his reelection bid in November 2022, a lot of Trump's handpicked MAGA candidates did really terribly in key swing state races. There was a time where Trump seemed vulnerable, but DeSantis waited for a long time to get in. By the time he got in, his support had already started to dip, and throughout the year, it just never developed in such a way that any of the Republican candidates got enough oxygen. There's some belief that the various indictments of Trump actually maybe helped him because, it's just, I think about like Bill Clinton's famous, like, I feel your pain moment. And for Trump, it's like, you feel my pain. And that, I'm being persecuted and you're going to feel that too. And, and again, like, different people can feel different ways about this, but the sort of persecution of Trump or whatever, however you want to define it, it was probably helpful to him in sort of keeping the loyalty of his party. But one thing I've just noticed about just following Trump for years is that, like, you can, it's like if you have like a balloon and you like press down on it, like you can make it smaller, but as soon as you take your hands off it, it expands back out to where it was. And like that's what Trump's support within the Republican Party has been to me, that unless there's constant pressure being applied to make his support smaller, it just naturally sort of comes back. And I think we saw some of that in Trump. And for Biden, it's easy to say he's weak, which he is based on what the numbers say. And it's also convenient to say, oh, well, Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, or Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, well, he'd be doing better. He'd be cleaning Trump's clock and all this. And like, you just don't know that to be sure, for sure. And the thing about all these hypothetical candidates is that they'll look great until they actually are candidates. And I mean, DeSantis himself is a fabulous example of that, because he looked great on paper. He was polling well. He actually becomes a candidate and he just ends up being a dud. And there are so many examples of that over the years, just in my relatively short time, 10, 15 years of really studying this stuff in depth. Scott Walker in 2016 and Rick Perry in 2012, and frankly Kamala Harris in 2020, although she's the vice president now. Just candidates who look great on paper and then they don't actually produce. And if you are a Democrat who has thoughts about running in the future, do you really want to challenge a sitting incumbent president when we know that an incumbent facing a primary challenge can be sort of a symptom or maybe even like a cause of them losing, because you rip the party apart. And so again, like, and I would maybe say the same thing about Trump too. It's like, yeah, Trump's weak, but what if Haley actually won the nomination? Would Trump just sort of take that in stride and support her? Of course he wouldn't. He would try to destroy her, and he would probably say, "Hey, don't vote for her," because he's not really a loyal figure in the party. So all of a sudden, she's always citing these polls. Oh, I beat Biden by 20 points or whatever. And like there are some polls that show that. There are other polls that show we're doing worse than Trump against Biden. but we don't know how this would actually shake out if they were nominated. So like on one hand, yeah, Biden and Trump, they have horrible weaknesses, both of them, and yet it's not necessarily clear the replacement candidate would be better. So and the voters, they have a say in this. Democratic voters did not demand another choice. They had a few other choices. They didn't take them. I mean, Biden was a write-in in New Hampshire. He got like 2/3 of the vote. And Dean Phillips was doing all sorts of stuff there, and when he got like 20%, and then was hardly registered. He finished behind Marianne Williamson the other day, who's like a total. She wasn't even running, and is a total non-entity anyway. So, it's just they just Biden never had a credible opponent, and Trump didn't want another, or the Republicans didn't want another choice.
So we are where we are, and this is what we're going to have. And what is it that so I assume, tell me if I'm wrong, but I assume the starting point to analyze this election is the last one, because you have the same two exact candidates running the same race. The Biden won an electoral college landslide. He won a popular vote landslide, but of course it was very tight in some of those key swing states. So what is it that we learn from 2020 as a springboard into watching this race in 2024?
So, again, same two candidates, although again, as I sort of suggested this before, 2016 may be a better comparison point, just because of both the larger share of people who are going to have a negative view of both candidates, and also the fact that you're going to have a more crowded third party ballot. But in terms of the key states, I mean, look, we're in a very competitive, closely competitive era in American campaigns elections, American presidential elections. And I have every reason to think that this is going to be another close and competitive one. But the difference between this era and maybe other competitive eras in American political history is that while the country as a whole is competitive, most of the states are not. So, in the Northeast and the West Coast, Biden is going to win in landslides. In much of the South and much of the interior West and Great Plains, Trump is going to win in a landslide. And in 2020, you only had 7 states that were decided by 3 percentage points or less. Arizona and Nevada out west, Georgia and North Carolina in the southeast, and then the 3 great industrial North states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the so-called blue wall that Trump knocked down barely in 2016, and then it reverted back to Biden in a competitive way in 2020. And those are really the states that are going to decide the election. And so that is pretty familiar to 2020. Trump won all but Nevada in 2016, and then Biden came back and won all but North Carolina in 2020. But those are really the places to watch. And that's why, like on Tuesday night, as we sort of search for drama in the primary season, there was this effort to vote uncommitted in the Michigan Democratic primary on Tuesday. There's a substantial, although not particularly huge, it's maybe 2 to 3% of with the electorate, maybe even smaller, of Arab American voters in places like Greater Detroit, what have you. And there was this effort to vote uncommitted on Biden because of Biden's support of Israel in this ongoing conflict in Gaza after the Hamas attacks on October 7th. And uncommitted got 13% of the vote. When Obama was running unopposed as an incumbent in 2012, uncommitted got 11%. Now Obama got 89, Biden got 81, and you did see in some of these heavily Arab American places that you did see uncommitted do really well and get majorities. However, that doesn't necessarily mean those places aren't going to vote for Biden, and the ultimate amount of votes we're talking about are small. But this intense focus on is Biden going to get 80 or 85% or 90% in the primary? Like, that's a whole lot different than like the 2016 primary, when like other candidates were actually winning some of the races. Some of I think what's going on is that there's a real just like desperation look for drama to try to make this primary season look competitive, and it's not. And I think Super Tuesday coming up next week is going to make that even clearer, when you've got big states like California and Texas voting that aren't going to be competitive either.
And so you obviously you mentioned the swing states. If we looked at those today, I think there was a poll that came out yesterday, a Bloomberg Morning Consult or something like that, that has Trump up in every single swing state. And as you said, don't think about 2020 as your benchmark for this election. Think about 2016. So if you think about 2016 as the benchmark and you look at the polls today, would you say right now Trump has the edge if the vote were today as to who would win?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you went by the polls, you'd call Trump a favorite. Now, I don't look at Trump as the favorite. I don't necessarily look at Biden as a favorite either. Again, it's sort of maybe it's kind of a cop out, but I just think it's history tells us that the polls are not necessarily predictive at this point. Now, look, maybe the polls are actually better than you'd think because it is a rematch and these are pretty well known candidates. But I think one of the things we saw in 2016 was that, like, when you think about in politics, just like you think about stereotypes of politicians, and it's like I want as much attention as I can get. I want the cameras on me. I focus on me. This election, and I think this was the case in 2016 too, the candidates probably want the focus to be on the other person because they're so unpopular. And so in 2016, there was this dynamic where, like, when Trump was the focus, he was doing worse. And then when Clinton was the focus, she was doing worse. And I think that election was so strange and topsy turvy that, if you had the election, in early October as opposed to early November when Trump was hit with famous Access Hollywood tape of him making all these horribly misogynist content or comments, Clinton probably would have won. And you could there was a back and forth all the time. I think part of what's going on is that Biden's the one who's getting all of the incoming right now. And I think it'll probably change at some point and Trump will get the incoming and maybe you'll see the numbers move around. There's also been, you think about like the demographics of the American electorate, um, like, basically like, younger voters are more Democratic, older voters are more Republican. And yet what the polls are showing, if you look at the crosstabs often, is that Biden's actually doing better amongst older people than you'd expect and doing way worse among young people. And like that tells me that either we're undergoing some sort of seismic shift in American politics or that the polls are wonky right now. And I tend to think it's more the latter. Again, that doesn't mean that Biden is favored or something. Again, I just think the polls are overstating Trump a little bit. And again, I just look at it as more of like a 50-50 kind of race. But certainly you could look at the polls and say Trump is favored. And he is, like if you look at like betting markets and things like that, Trump is favored. But I think that stuff is just sort of following the polls. I just think it's a little too early.